Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's event. My name is Nick Pearce. I'm a professor of public policy at the University of Bath, where I direct the Institute for Policy Research, and I'm your host for this evening's event. A very big welcome to you from wherever you're joining us. I'm delighted this evening that we are interviewing and in conversation with Lauren Fedor, who is the FT, the Financial Times US political correspondent based out in Washington. It's lunchtime there in Washington. You can see Lauren. She's the deputy bureau chief, and she covers the whole spectrum of American politics, the White House, Congress, national politics, including the subject of our discussion this evening, the 2024 presidential election that we've just seen held in the US. So we're going to debate what happened in that election, what we can expect in the future, or how we can think about the future of American politics in its many different dimensions. We'll have about 40 minutes of conversation between Lauren and I, and then we'll take your questions. And if you could submit them as the audience in the Q&A function, we'll pick them up and I'll put those to Lauren in the course of the conversation. So a big welcome to everybody. That's probably enough for me. I'm going to now hand over and start our process of discussion with Lauren. Welcome, Lauren. Very nice to see you. I want to, if I may, just begin with this, the question of sort of what's happened. What happened in this election? How did Trump win and why? What were the kind of the components, the ingredients of this victory?
I think, when we talk about the election result, we use a variety of adjectives, one of which is decisive. It was a decisive victory for President Trump and the Republican Party. We were heading into November 5th, knowing that this was in terms of the prediction markets, the betting markets were betting on President Trump, but, the polls suggested this was going to be a coin toss.
Right.
However, I think that many of us who follow American politics quite closely had perhaps underestimated just how decisive President Trump's victory would be, but Republican victories would be up and down the ballot. President Trump didn't just win the Electoral College, which I'm sure listeners understand is the kind of arcane way in which elections are decided in the US, but he won the popular vote too, which is no easy feat for a Republican. It hadn't been done in 2 decades. He expanded his margins in nearly every state in the United States. The Republicans will be going into next year controlling both chambers of Congress, excuse me. This is a real ringing endorsement of his vision of America. And I think that, he and his allies will say he's returning to Washington, as it were, with a clear mandate. In terms of why, the postmortems are ongoing. But I think that when we look at exit polls and some of the patterns that we've seen in terms of surveys post-election, it's clear that President Trump was able to supercharge this victory with support from a variety of demographic groups who maybe historically, in recent history, have not supported the Republican Party. Is socioeconomically, the working class is behind President Trump, and that cuts across ethnic groups. But he was really able to run up his margins with Hispanic voters, African-American voters. There's been a lot of discussion about his appeal to younger men in particular, who are across the board less likely to vote than their older counterparts, but turned out, we believe, in relatively large numbers for him. But, he did well with female voters too. He just had a very, very strong performance across the board.
So how much of that is about anti-incumbency? And so voting against a party in power, that's been something that the Financial Times has explored on its pages, is whether this is part of a worldwide phenomenon that parties in power, after a period of high inflation, where prices have gone up, and even if real wages have done okay, people are still seeing pocketbook issues defecting how they vote. How much is it that, do you think? And how much is it about Trump, his agenda, enthusiasm for the arguments he made?
It's difficult to quantify, right? At the end of the day, I can't give you a perfect kind of, it was this percent this and this percent that. But I think that the anti-incumbency sentiment that you touch on is clear here in the US and across the West generally. Obviously in the UK, France, we've seen lots of examples in the recent months of incumbent leaders, particularly incumbent leaders who were leading during the pandemic. I think there is still a a hangover effect, despite being several years on now from that. Not only economically, but perhaps just in a broader sentiment about how people feel about their leadership. You know, I think that the economy in the US, if we're looking again in a comparative perspective, has had a relatively robust recovery compared to some of our G7 peers. But it is nevertheless true that inflation has been you know, a feature of life here now for many years. Prices are much higher than they were when President Biden came into office. And that was a central message for President Trump. It wasn't as grabby or controversial in the headlines as some of the other things that we spent the last couple of months reporting on and talking about. But the reality is most Americans feel as though they're being pinched, that there's a cost of living problem here, just as there is in the UK. And they were receptive to his pitch that he's going to make it better. Will he? You know, that's a whole separate kind of conversation. But I think that was an important piece of the puzzle. In terms of him, his unique personality and presentation, I think it in some ways actually dovetails from that, though, which is that despite the fact that he actually has been president of the United States before, despite the fact that he is a very prominent, wealthy, successful individual, people still view him as anti-establishment and someone who's fighting for the quote unquote little guy. And I think that resonates particularly again with the working classes in the US, that he's in their corner. Whereas the Democratic Party is confronting you know, a difficult and uncomfortable reality for them, that in the eyes of many voters, they're seen as elitist and out of touch and coastal, you know, here being, you know, big cities like New York and San Francisco rather than representative of the average American in the middle.
And so is that in a sense because the Democrats are seen as representing the, if you like, the professional liberal middle class, Trump as a sort of as a populist figure, if you like. I mean, let's talk about what that means in due course, but is presenting himself certainly as rich and successful. You know, it makes that a major part of how he projects himself, but in a way that's seen to be, as it were, both sort of masculine, virtuous, non-judgmental, something that, you know, that working class people can say is valid and worthy of aspiration, in contrast to the sort of the professional middle class of lawyers, doctors, university professors, and others. Is that what's going on here? A kind of a refashioning of how you think about class in that way?
Yeah, I mean, you used the word aspiration, and I think there is something for these voters. And I recognize for people who find President Trump off-putting, this is hard to wrap your head around. But for his supporters, there is something aspirational about what he stands for. People see him as embodying the American dream. And I think for a certain segment of the working class, you know, they think that he is supporting them in their own aspirations and goals to achieve that kind of wealth and success as well. So that's definitely part of it. It was part of it in 2016 too, but I think this time around, particularly with some you know, racial and ethnic groups, there's also some discussion that they felt perhaps pandered to by the Democratic Party, or told that they were you know, put upon in some way or disadvantaged. And I've spoken to voters who that perception you know, really sat with them the wrong way. And they thought that they were just as American as anyone else, or had just as many opportunities as anyone else, and didn't want to be told otherwise. So I think that's part of the psychology here too.
And is it also the case? I mean, the received wisdom seems to be that Kamala Harris and the Democrats just did not fight on the terrain of the economy. That they didn't either mount a defense of Biden's record, which for many people has been a very good one. I mean, the British left in particular has seen Bidenomics as something to emulate, but didn't fight on the defense of that record, but neither on a kind of economic change agenda. You just simply didn't have the same kind of appeal to economic interests as the Republicans mounted. Would that be your assessment?
I think that's right. You know, there is a pretty widespread consensus now that President Biden, when he was the candidate, had the wrong message on the economy. He did a lot of borderline scolding of the electorate. Don't you realize how good you have it? Don't you realize that the US is growing faster? Our inflation has come down faster. Our labor market is robust. Like things are pretty good. So stop whinging was kind of the message. And that doesn't sit well with people, right? If their grocery bills are high, if their energy bills cost to heat their home or fuel their car, which obviously loads of Americans are reliant on their cars to get around, that goes down like a lead balloon. I think Kamala Harris and her team did try to distance herself from that, but whether it was on the economy or on a variety of other issues, at the end of the day, she really just had 100 days to try to position herself as an alternative or something more forward-looking than Biden. And I think, when the history books will look back on this, she'll be seen as someone who failed at that, that she was painted by the same brushstroke, whether it was on the economy or some of these other social issues. We haven't even touched on immigration yet, which is a salient issue here in the US as it is, again, across Europe. And that's something that President Trump was able to effectively tap into. And both the Biden administration and then the Harris campaign have often struggled to mount a credible kind of defense of their policies.
Yeah. Let's just dwell on the gender point, if we may, for a minute. So, I mean, clearly Trump in a lot of his campaign appealed to men. He appealed as a man in a certain way of thinking about masculinity, but and to men. And at the same time, Kamala Harris also sought to mobilize, particularly, I think, suburban women voters, the question of abortion, obviously, and Supreme Court judgment and what that's meant, but sought to mobilize against that sense of a misogynist, masculine Republican candidate. And yet that doesn't seem to have played out well at all. And in fact, actually, I think I'm right in saying that Harris got a lower proportion of female voters than Biden had done, even if Trump got more young men than he did in 2016. So in a sense, or 2020. So how do you think that gender dimension played out in the election? Is it as I've described it there?
Yeah, I think it's multifaceted, right? I think that President Trump clearly did make direct appeals to men, to younger men in particular, to younger working class men. You can see it in his media strategy where he went for interviews. He sat down with a lot of podcast hosts that are popular with younger men. Joe Rogan is the kind of famous example. But that was a tactical choice to reach those individuals who are not paying attention to the mainstream media. They're not reading the Financial Times. They're not watching CNN. They're harder to reach, and he sought them out. And then, from that, there was also a very macho message, as you alluded to, very masculine message that clearly resonated with some people. I think the Democrats thought that the flip side of that coin would be that it would turn off women. And the reality is a lot of women were able to overlook that or, weren't particularly bothered by it. I think that the Democrats in recent, we're only talking about 2.5 years since the US Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. Yeah. And I think that the Democrats had long been betting that, as it was in the midterms of that year, that this would fuel their election victories, that they would overperform expectations. And what we've seen in 2024 is that maybe they can't bet on that as a silver bullet. And I don't have a clear answer, and I don't think anyone does, as to why that's the case. But there is some suggestion, without getting too much into the weeds on this, but what happened with the US Supreme Court meant that there was no longer a national right to access to an abortion, and it kicked the issue down to the states. And what we've seen in the last 2 years is that state governments and judiciaries have been wrestling with this issue and setting their own boundaries on a state-by-state basis. We've had a lot of referenda in different states where the public has been able to vote. On the whole, these referenda have guaranteed abortion rights. But, people I've spoken to, both voters and kind of experts on the ground, would suggest that this has allowed voters to kind of bifurcate the issue or separate the issue out in some way. So Florida is a very good example, and it's a state that I actually went and did some reporting on shortly before the election. It's a state Donald Trump won comfortably. It's a state that the Republican Senate candidate won comfortably. And you also had nearly 60% of people there voting in favor of abortion rights. And I recognize, again, particularly maybe outside of the US, that's hard to kind of wrap your head around. But for a lot of voters, a lot of female voters, they were able to do both. They were able to tick a box to secure their abortion rights or reproductive rights, but they were also able to tick a box to choose the Republican Party if they felt that better represented their economic or other interests.
Yeah. And do you think, is there anything in the argument that Trump was beaten by a male candidate in 2020? He's beaten two women in 2016 and 2024. Is there something in the argument that Americans are not yet ready to vote for a woman as their president in a way that Europeans are very comfortable voting for prime ministers and leaders?
I think there is something in the argument. I think that there are a lot of people, both Democrats and Republicans, who would like to think there isn't, quite frankly. I would say that American voters are happy to elect. We've had many female governors in this country, and those are powerful executive roles. And there are many female governors right now, and there have been historically. It's just that presidential ticket that seems to be a hard one to crack. I would say when you're comparing the US to Europe, it's important to remember that it is different to cast a vote in a presidential system versus a parliamentary one. And there are women who've ascended to, number 10 or other kind of prime ministerial posts who, have won leadership elections within their party rather than being elected by the general public. But it's certainly something that both parties are grappling with. I think the Democrats in particular, because without wishing away the next 4 years, the Democrats are already thinking about 2028. And while no one would want to say this out loud or publicly, quietly, there are a lot of Democrats who are thinking, do we really want to run the risk of having a woman candidate again? Would we be safer picking a male candidate or perhaps a white male candidate to kind of have the least differentiation, I guess, in terms of diversity.
Let's just come back before we move on to other issues. Let's just come back to the question of immigration then. So firstly, how big an issue was immigration, and why, contrary to kind of received wisdom, did it not appear to be an issue that put off Latino voters in particular from voting for Trump? What's going on there in American politics?
Look, exit polling consistently suggests that for Republican voters in particular, immigration is a top 3 issue, let's say, depending on the way that you ask the question. It is something that President Trump, if the economy was number 1, immigration was number 2 for him in terms of his messaging. We saw that in 2016 too. We wanted to build the wall. I mean, this is a perennial theme for him. But it was also difficult for Democrats, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, to counter message because there was a sharp increase in border crossings, particularly in the US-Mexico border, after President Trump left and after President Biden came in. And we had, not that many years ago, we had these Republican governors in what initially looked like a stunt, sending migrants away from border communities in places like Texas and sending them to cities in the northern parts of the US, in places like Chicago or New York or here in DC. And that brought the immigration problem to the doorsteps of lots of people who, otherwise would not really have felt this issue personally. And it strained, when I use the word problem, I don't mean to be loaded there. It created a strain on public resources and put the issue front and center and how communities and local governments deal with it, right? So I think it was put on the map in a very clear way, and it was something that was on the minds of a lot of Americans. In terms of Latino voters and how they respond to it, I think we have now seen time and again that for those who came to the US, maybe they're immigrants themselves, maybe they're from first-generation families where the parents came to the US, there is a belief among a lot of those people that if I followed the right procedure, then you should too, right? So there's very little sympathy, I guess, for undocumented workers or people coming here who are not going through the traditional channels of the immigration process. And there's a belief that if I followed the rules, you could follow the rules. basically.
Yes, and that's a phenomenon we see in Europe too, that
Mm.
uh, second and third immigrant generation families resisting or rejecting more newly arrived migrants. Um, let's just move on a bit to then the kind of Trump operation, the team and things. So one of the arguments around 2016 was he had this kind of chaotic patrimonial mafiosi style family operation that was the Trump family. And in his presidency, you know, it was all very chaotic, lots of turnover of personnel. And that, you know, in this manifestation, he's got his act together, his operation is together. They fought whatever people say about his stump speeches, it was a more disciplined operation. They're better prepared for government. He has an agenda. You know, whatever you think of it, it's a more fully worked out agenda. Um, and the people around him appear to be people that have kind of come on board onto his agenda. Um, Certainly from the UK, the thing that seems you know, most characteristic of it, apart from this sense of a kind of more determination and purpose to his operation, is that you've got the arrival of people like Elon Musk and others. You've got these, you know, billionaires and other figures who are kind of suddenly central to what
Mm.
Trump is doing and central to his preparations for government. And some have been nominated, obviously, into key roles in his cabinet. So what's been going on there? What's happened in the kind of Trump inner circle or the Trump operation?
Well, let's see, there's a lot there, so I'll see if
Yeah,
I can take it in turn. And if I skip something, please
yeah,
remind me and I'll come back to it.
yeah.
I think that for President Trump, his family has always been central to the inner circle,
Mm,
and they continue to be. The cast of characters has maybe changed slightly. In 2016, his daughter Ivanka Trump and her husband Jared Kushner had roles in the administration.
yes.
At this stage, we expect that they will have a more hands-off approach. They were not really very active on the campaign. And his daughter in particular has not expressed any interest in kind of returning to government. But his other sons, Donald Trump Jr. And Eric Trump, have played a far more central role. You know, it has been widely reported, we reported it too, that they were some of the loudest voices in his ear, for example, advocating for J.D. Vance to be his
Yeah.
vice president. And, you know, on election night, once again, the Trump family kind of posed for a photo at Mar-a-Lago when it was clear that the former president was going to be the president-elect. And the most interesting thing, though, in that photo to me was that you had the president, all of his adult children, their spouses, their grandchildren, and Elon Musk. And he is definitely the newest kind of entrant to this inner circle, but he does seem to be being welcomed as if he were a member of the family, which is,
Mm,
you know, noteworthy to say the least. There really hasn't been a figure like that in Trump's political career to date.
mm,
You know, we all know who Musk is and his kind of successes as a business figure and an innovator. He's obviously hugely polarizing when it comes to political issues. And
mm,
at least for now, he has the ear of the president, and he's been in the room for a lot of these meetings and decisions about who President Trump is selecting for his cabinet and other key roles. I think there are people in Washington who were watching that with intrigue and some trepidation. There are others who believe that this bromance, as it were, let's see how long it lasts. These are two really strong personalities, to say the least, who have a record of falling out with people. Whether or not the friendship can sustain, and that Musk is going to be interested in being this closely involved for however long. I mean, 4 years is a long time.
mm,
We'll have to see. You know, he's been tasked right now with this kind of government efficiency program, which is called Doge, with Vivek Ramaswamy, who is a one-time challenger to President Trump turned kind of acolyte. There are a lot of questions in Washington as well about how that will actually work. Right now, it's basically a commission that's outside of government that has been
mm,
tasked with gutting the civil service here in the US.
mm.
There has been nothing like it before. And so I can't sit here and tell you, looking into my crystal ball, how that will all play out. But I think Musk as a central figure in this Trump circle is fascinating.
Mm.
In terms of the theme of discipline that you mentioned earlier, I think that
Yeah.
that has been consistent really throughout the entire bid really for another term in the White House. There were times when the president-elect's advisors had their heads in their hands because he would go off wildly off script on stage, and they were concerned that he was, throwing it all away. But when it comes to the actual operation, and I know that sounds less exciting, but that is how the sausage gets made,
Yeah.
is very professionalized. He's picked someone in his White House chief of staff, Susie Wiles, who is a real veteran of not only working with President Trump. She has had a positive working relationship with him now for several years, which is atypical often in Trump world. But she's worked on Republican Party politics for 30 years. That is the single number one person that people point to when they're talking about the kind of professionalism and discipline of both the campaign and the incoming administration. And whether or not she'll be able to keep the wheels on for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, we'll have to see. Chief of staff is a really, really important job in the American presidency. It is the ultimate kind of gatekeeper for the president and really sets the runnings in many ways. President Trump went through 4 of them his first time around. We'll see if maybe that number is a bit smaller this time.
Yes, and it was noticeable that Susie Wiles was his first announced appointment, wasn't she? I mean, and widely welcomed in Republican circles. So clearly playing a kind of pivotal role. I mean, the question of Musk, obviously, there's something personal to him in the kind of radicalization of his own politics, the way he's gone across to the right and the way he's radicalized others. But Silicon Valley as a whole appeared to kind of either acquiesce or actively support Trump this time around, in contrast to previous elections. And of course, you also had this great enthusiasm from the sort of libertarian Bitcoin cryptocurrency communities as well. And there seems to be this sense in which, that if you like, that large element of American capitalism in the big tech companies, as well as in the kind of more wilder fringes of it, had shifted into the anti-democrat camp, in a way that big oil and the fossil fuel industries were already there. They were funding and supporting him, and probably in a way that in the past was also less true. That Wall Street as well. That Wall Street seemed to welcome Trump's election, the stock market doing very well and all the rest of it, big figures touted for the Treasury Secretary and so on. So it looks like Trump had quite big elements of American corporate world, whether tech, Wall Street, oil and gas, energy, on his side, wanting him to succeed. Rather than the Democrats. What is that about, do you think? What does that tell us about American political economy? It's a big question, but
yeah, no, I was going to say, and I should be careful to kind of parcel out different sectors, and obviously there are still Democrats in the upper echelons of American business. I think oil and gas is maybe the most straightforward one. Trump says that he's going to drill, baby, drill. He's going to, cast aside concerns about climate and the environment, and he's going to resume natural gas drilling and basically just create a windfall for these companies, right? So there's a real clear self-interest there in that sector. I think Wall Street, it was a little bit more of there were some enthusiastic supporters. Harold Lutnick, who is currently co-chair of the transition, and then will also be taking up the role, should he be confirmed, of Commerce Secretary. Is the head of Cantor Fitzgerald, a big kind of Wall Street figure who had previously supported Democrats and then really embraced President Trump. But Wall Street was a little bit more divided. I think that there were these individuals who really came around to him and to his message for a variety of reasons. Part of that is self-interest too. He said that not only does he want to extend the tax cuts that he brought about in 2017, which were massive at the time, but he wants to go further. So he wants to renew them and then go further by slashing taxes across the board, including for corporations. That's something that big business, not only on Wall Street, but in a variety of sectors, really welcomes. I would caution that there are still Republicans out there who believe in budget discipline. And a lot of the tax promises that President Trump has made are going to come with a pretty big bill. And I would anticipate, one thing I feel comfortable predicting for 2025 is that we're going to have a lot of intra-Republican Party fighting about those tax reforms and just how much they're willing to spend from the public purse in order to stomach that loss of revenue.
yeah,
Silicon Valley is a slightly different beast, and I don't cover Silicon Valley. I have colleagues who do, and so I don't want to necessarily speak as an authority on it. But there's a lot of, you alluded to the libertarian. There's a lot of kind of independent-minded, big personalities out there. Musk is just one of them, who I think in some ways are also drawn to his message, whether it be on the economy, but also on issues of free speech, cultural issues, these kind of
yeah,
things. One other big, I would say, kind of like titan of tech that we haven't mentioned, and he did take a far lower profile position than he has in the past, is Peter Thiel, who
yeah,
was, a mentor to JD Vance, a mentor to actually several of the individuals, not as big names, who've been kind of tapped for administration jobs. And so I think that kind of psychology and worldview will permeate this new administration in
yeah.
interesting, potentially very interesting ways.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's move on to then to the question of sort of, substantively what might happen after the inauguration once he assumes office. I mean, obviously the big thing that has dominated the pages of the Financial Times has been tariffs, and Trump this week saying that the first thing he'll do is put 25% tariffs on Mexican, Canadian, and Chinese goods coming into the States. I mean, obviously at this point, it's hard to know how much of that is a negotiating bluster and threat and how much is substantial and real. But it does seem as if Trump, in his political economy, has decided that tariffs will form a large part, both for the raising of revenue, as he sees it, in contrast to the taxes he wants to cut, but also as a kind of geopolitical strategy. And I wonder, from the appointments we've had, from the sort of, your understanding and knowledge of Republican politics, how much
Mm.
of that agenda we're really going to see. Because as with fiscal questions, obviously the Republican Party has historically been a party, of free trade and, or at least in the recent post-war history, not
Mm.
a party of tariffs and protection, more a party of liberalizing trade. So how might that play out?
I think that broadly speaking, both for Republicans and Democrats, the mood in post NAFTA really in the United States has progressively moved away from free trade and towards protectionism. And we see that, like I said, both on the left and the right.
Yeah.
I think President Trump is quite far out there, though, in his enthusiasm for
Mm,
tariffs as a tool, both, as you note, kind of economically and geopolitically.
mm,
The reality is that for technical reasons, President Trump may be able to weaponize tariffs without really having to get Congress on board. He can claim national security exemptions and all sorts of other
right.
ways to act through the executive, through the White House, without needing to negotiate really with his fellow Republicans. So that does weaken the hand of those who still value or prioritize free trade. We have
Mm,
seen in some of his appointments thus far as well that this was the Treasury Secretary, for example, was an appointment that took a bit of time. And our
mm,
understanding is that, he wanted to make sure that the people he's surrounding himself with are on board with this vision and this priority. Now, as you also said, these are threats at this stage. We know that President Trump likes to threaten things. He likes to make a deal and negotiate. And so I think it's also fair to see all of this as the opening salvo in what will be a kind of fraught series of negotiations that, could descend into an all-out trade war, and with real consequences, both for the consumer and for the broader economy and the global economy. But right now, we're kind of seeing the early stages of how he's going to try to position himself and
mm,
just how far he's willing to take it.
mm. Now, the other issue, obviously, for Europeans, in addition to tariffs, whether they're levied on the UK or the EU or however they're done, is obviously Ukraine. I mean, I think
Mm.
going back to your earlier point, in a sense, with climate change, it's just sort of already sort of baked into people's assumptions that, that they leave the Paris Agreement again, that everything goes backwards and you just have to get on with things absent the Americans. I mean, that's a sort of general feeling on climate change. But Ukraine is different, because obviously partly for Europeans, it's in the neighborhood. and partly because people don't really know what's going to happen, how much of Trump saying he's going to just bring peace on day one, what that really means. Does it mean acquiescence to the Russians? Does it mean acquiescence in the existing um, battlefield, if you like, and territory in Ukraine? What do you think about that again? I mean, is it true that ideologically the Republicans are just much more sympathetic now to Russia and to, if you like, authoritarian leaders, and less inclined to support the West, or is Trump going to do as pretty much as he did in his first term, sort of push the Europeans in certain directions, but in practice not really change America's posture in these areas as radically as people fear?
I think that most people would probably bet that the latter is how this is going to play out again. But there
Mm,
are just so many unknowns because he really hasn't specified what he means when he says he'll end it on day one.
mm,
I think that uh, when you ask about whether the Republicans are more pro Russia rather than they were, obviously there's a strand of the Republican Party that feels differently about Russia than any Republican ever would have in the 80s when Ronald Reagan was president. There has clearly been a move, particularly on the far right of the Republican Party,
mm,
on that issue. But I
mm,
think that Ukraine, Russia, this kind of dimension of geopolitics is one of the few areas where we still do see really robust disagreement among the Republicans. And we've seen that play out just in the last year or so when it has come to renewing US aid for Ukraine. Mike Johnson, who's the Republican Speaker of the House, a fierce loyalist to Donald Trump, ended up being the kind of pivotal point person to appropriating the most recent big piece of legislation that sent
mm,
huge amounts of aid from the US to Ukraine. Mitch McConnell, who is the outgoing Republican leader in the Senate, has
mm,
long been a real Russia hawk and advocated for this issue. And I would expect his successor to share a kind of similar worldview to him. So we may very well see again, this could be an area where President Trump runs into his own party on Capitol Hill, and there's some pretty aggressive kind of disagreement and negotiation. There's
mm,
also a variety of unknowns on this one, though, because President Trump hasn't necessarily defined what his policy will look like. On the one hand, he picked a vice president in JD Vance, who is someone who is very critical of Volodymyr Zelensky and has been very loath for Americans to continue to send support to Kyiv. But on the other hand, some of these other national security appointments or foreign policy appointments start to feel a little bit more conventional. So someone like Marco Rubio, for example, who's
yeah,
been tapped as the Secretary of State and is there are a lot of controversial appointments that we could get into in this conversation. Marco Rubio is not one of them. I think if I were a betting woman, I would say that he'll probably be confirmed with the most bipartisan support of any of these names, and he's respected by his colleagues across the aisle. He's
mm,
not seen as particularly radical. Well, he's more of a China hawk than someone invested in kind of Russia-related issues. I would expect him to take a more traditional establishment
mm,
Republican stance when it comes to Europe.
mm,
So
mm.
there are a variety of voices and kind of perspectives that President Trump will be hearing. And ultimately, there's one decision maker in a Trump White House, and we know who that is, but he's a pretty difficult one to predict.
To predict, yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's before we go to over to our audience questions, let's just end on a couple of big things, if I may, and
Mm.
they're not straightforward, but let's see where we get. So the first is the future of the Democrats. What do they now do as they regroup? What will be the character, ideological positioning? How do they reflect on this election,
Mm.
and where as a party do they go? Are they going to think that they've got to go more to the left on economic issues, but be less liberal on some of the kind of cultural questions? Is it about leadership and structure? Is it a generational problem, the Nancy Pelosi, Biden, gerontocracy, so-called kind of problem? So one issue is about the future of Democrats. Be just really interested in some thoughts on that. And then the other is this question, before the October election, before Trump's victory, a lot of American academics, political commentators, serious people saying this is a fascist candidate. He's at the head of a fascist movement. It's not disguising itself. This is a very big threat to the American Republic. and it's going to change in some profound ways. And it may not look like 1930s Italy or Germany, but it may well look like contemporary Hungary, and it may look like other parts of the world where authoritarians have taken control and the liberal elements of liberal democracy fall away. So, two very big questions. Don't expect you to be able to, spend forever on them, but just some thoughts on those ones.
Okay, so taking the Democrats to
Mm.
start, it's messy, to say the least. And I think that it is all of those issues that you have laid out and more. And if we think about the US versus the UK kind of context here, the UK style of government looks nice and tidy by comparison, because if we were in a parliamentary system, they would have chucked out or be on their way to checking out the leader. There'd be a leadership election. We'd have a new leader. That person would have some sort of mandate to sketch out their vision in opposition, right?
Yeah.
We don't have a system that works like that in the US by any means. There are potentially personnel changes in some key roles in the next couple of years, and individuals who could exert some influence over the party. There's the Democratic National Committee, which is the kind of organizing, fundraising principle. They will, party members will select a new leader for that. But that's more of like an operational role. The DNC chair doesn't then become the presidential candidate.
Yeah.
So that will be one thing to look out for next year. Leadership on Capitol Hill looks to remain the same. The Democratic leader in both the House and the Senate will be the same. Hakeem Jeffries in the House and Chuck Schumer in the Senate. But I don't think that people are necessarily looking to them as the kind of future leaders of the party or the standard bearers necessarily. They'll have their work cut out for them just in simply trying to stymie Trump's legislative agenda where they can.
Yeah.
I think, believe it or not, we're just going to have to wait till the next round of elections, and those are really going to start to force the issue and the hands of some of these Democrats. So there will be a couple of off-year elections. Even years are the years that we have big elections here in the US. Midterms will be in 2 years. The next presidential will be in 4. But I think next year there'll be a handful of governor's races that will be very, very closely watched. We'll all become experts in Virginia and New Jersey politics because the figures running for the governorships there will really have an opportunity and a platform to kind of speak to what they think the Democratic branch should be. Those are both states actually as well where President Trump really, really improved his margins. He didn't win, but he really, really improved his margins, and so will therefore be very hotly contested, I think. The midterms then as well, we'll see whether or not they're kind of fresher candidates. And then as soon as the midterms are done, I know everyone, particularly outside the US, thinks this is absolutely insane, but the presidential race will start, by the end of 2026. We will have plenty of Democrats declaring their candidacy for president. And that's really where this, I think, ideological battle will be fought. I would expect we'd have a big field. We did in 2020 too, before it contracted very quickly behind President Biden. But I would expect a big field, several probably state governors to put themselves forward, maybe some ambitious legislators as well. And I think that's where the fight's really going to happen. It's going to be taken to the Democratic electorate in the primaries to decide which way they want to go.
Yeah. Yep.
Is that enough on that one?
That's that. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
In terms of the future of democracy here in the US, I think it is absolutely true that the Democrats campaigned on this issue, talked a lot about this issue. And the uncomfortable truth for a lot of Democrats is that Donald Trump won fair and square. He won that decisive victory, I said at the outset. And that's what the electorate wants. I think there are big open questions about how he approaches his job and whether or not he seeks to expand presidential power beyond the scope of what the Constitution seems to allow for. I think there were a lot of alarm bells raised by his selection of Matt Gaetz as the U.S. Attorney General, and questions about whether he would abuse kind of the power that he might have over the judiciary. Gaetz, I think probably most listeners know, fell apart in spectacular fashion and has already withdrawn his name for consideration. Pam Bondi, the replacement candidate, is seen as far more mainstream, although a loyalist to President Trump. I think how he interacts with the judiciary will be one place to look.
Yeah.
But the optimist take would be that the institutions held 4 years ago, when President Trump did try to bend the institutions to his will and overturn the results of a free and fair election.
Yeah.
And so there is perhaps cautious optimism here that the same will hold true this time. But it's
I mean
it's a fragile time. So
yes. I mean that is that in fact that's the first of the questions we have from our audiences.
mm,
You know, if the Republicans, as they now do, control the executive, both houses of the legislature and the Supreme Court, that do those institutional checks and balances work in the way that they're designed to do? The American Constitution designed principally to frustrate tyrannical power, the concentration of power.
mm.
Does it continue to be one? I mean, there's also a debate going on, isn't there, at the level of the states where, governors and others are saying we're going to mobilize to defend our citizens against deportation, for example, or we're going to mobilize to defend our state level constitutions against encroachment and so on. So I suppose it's, just your sense that just because Trump perhaps controls, or the Republicans control the levers of power in Washington, that there's still quite a lot in the institutional structure of American democracy that will protect it.
I would agree with that. I think it's still far easier to be a leader and get what you want to get done when you have a clear majority in a parliamentary system. When it comes to Congress, for example, we're expecting a razor thin majority in the House. Believe it or not, they're still counting the results in some House races, so we don't know the final split there. But it's looking
Yes.
increasingly likely that, at least at the start of the year, Mike Johnson could have a majority of 1 or 2. That's basically nothing. So
Yeah.
there is a possibility there for a handful of rebels to really stand in the way. Equally in the Senate, the Gates confirmation is a clear example of this. It didn't progress to even the beginning stages of a vetting process because we know that at least 4 Republican senators told President Trump's team, look, I'm never going to vote for him. So there are glimmers, perhaps, at least on Capitol Hill, that there will be roadblocks there for President Trump. And I think, again, another quirk of American institutions is this is a federalist structure. And so state governors are able to exert a fair amount of influence. There are mechanisms by which they can push back on the federal government. Gavin Newsom in California is an example of this. Is someone who's made quite clear that he intends to do that. And I think that you would expect that to play out in other states as well. The last piece of that puzzle is the Supreme Court. It is obviously stacked in favor of the conservatives now, but they're not, and I know probably some listeners would think, they'll roll their eyes at me saying this, but they're not party political. They are independent of the party apparatus. And we do see conservative justices rule on a variety of issues in a way that perhaps the Republican Party would not want them to. So it is still while an institution that has become increasingly political in recent decades, it is still an independent institution at the end of the day.
I mean, there's a question in the chat related to that, which is, what does this mean for sort of civil society organizations? The kind of, I suppose, the fear that, Trump will use the Department of Justice, will use the machinery of the state to go after organizations that are defending migrant rights or trying to defend the environment or seeking to resist elements of his agenda, and whether we will see more of that kind of Republican use of the state to kind of prosecute that kind of agenda. Just as we've seen, for example, in Florida and Texas, state universities now no longer able to teach certain things. We have seen attempts to, as it were, to get into civil society.
I mean, President Trump has said that he wants to pursue his enemies and seek retribution. This is another area where he said it several times over, more times, than I could count, but we don't really know what he means. I would throw the, mainstream media and journalists into that category as well. He's described as enemies of the people. It is is it a genuine and credible threat that he's made? And we'll have to see whether the judiciary, the Department of the Judiciary under his administration would be willing to try to carry that out. I would imagine that any of these kind of very extreme moves would be quickly challenged in the courts, and then there'll be stays on these things. And I think there's going to be a lot of stop, start, where and we saw it in 2016 too, where he would seek to do something perhaps very extreme. Immediately, someone would propose a legal challenge, and it would get wrapped up in the courts for a long time. And I feel confident in predicting that we might see more of that next year too.
Okay, we've got quite a few questions and not a great deal of time, so I'm going to be quick fire with them if I may, Lauren.
Okay.
So I should have asked few of myself. But the first is what does it tell us about America that they can elect somebody that tried to effectively stage a coup in January the 6th, or has it been a convicted criminal? What does it tell us about does this say something about the moral state of America that we should worry about?
Big question if I'm short on time. I mean, I think people have clearly are willing to overlook these things, which is remarkable. I think doing my job as I have for the last 5 years, it's become a cliche to use the word unprecedented, but we are living in unprecedented times. I think people have short memories, to be honest. And I think that after January 6th, there was a real kind of chill that settled over the country, and people were shocked by what had happened. And 3.5 years later, everyone was willing to move beyond it. So I don't know. I'm not an ethicist. I don't know if I'm the right one to kind of dig into the American psyche more, but people are certainly willing to forgive and forget, shall we say.
Okay, let's just go back a little bit to the question of the kind of sociological drivers of the election. Has America become very polarized between a resentful left behind working class and a kind of liberal professional elite, and reflected in its geography, as you were saying earlier, of kind of East Coast, West Coast versus the large parts of the South and the Midwest? Is it, or actually have we seen an election where there's quite a kind of cross-class popular appeal for the Republicans?
I think maybe, if I'm looking back on the last kind of 50 minutes of our conversation, maybe it's my fault for kind of underplaying this fact of division. Donald Trump won handily. The Republicans won handily. They improved their numbers. But at the end of the day, he won the popular vote by just over 50%, which means that the other half of the country did not vote for him. And I think that the other half of the country, on a large part, feels very, very aggressively anti-President Trump. And you see those divisions play out not only in politics, but in media and cultural issues. This is a sharply divided country. And President Trump didn't necessarily promise that he was going to try to unite the country. So we could see those divisions kind of just harden and embed further over the next 4+ years. Or we might see the Democrats start to try to appeal maybe to more of that middle in an effort to kind of rebuild some sort of bridges. It just kind of remains to be seen.
Yeah. Okay, and then just one last substantive one is on foreign policy. So we've talked about Ukraine already. China, where it appears that there's a kind of hawkish consensus in Washington, and he'll further that. Other regions, Africa, the Middle East, anything particular we should think about?
I think the kind of conflict in the Middle East is particularly interesting, and one that we'll continue to follow quite closely. Obviously, we've had now this ceasefire in place for not very long at all between Israel and Lebanon, but we still have the conflict in Gaza. Again, this is a conflict that President Trump has said very little about how he would end it, but claims he would end it. And when it came to the ceasefire with Lebanon, I mean, he was saying, his advisors actually were saying just as recently as yesterday, well, actually, this is all about President Trump because he's coming in and they're basically trying to take credit already. I think that is going to be a pretty pressing concern for his team, the conflict in Gaza, as they take over, assuming that there isn't some ceasefire reached there between now and the end of January. President Trump has had a up and down relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu. He moved the U.S. embassy, but also they have locked horns on occasion. And I think that relationship will be one to follow quite closely and not only with Israel, but his broader relationships with the Saudis and other kind of players in the Middle East
Yes.
will be fascinating to see how that plays out in Trump 2.0.
Yes, because he's appointed a very right-wing evangelical supporter of Israel to the ambassadorship, hasn't he, with Mick Huckabee? But he's also got these links to Saudi Arabia, and
Yeah, yeah.
his obviously his son-in-law as well. And so there is a that's an interesting dynamic. South America is another one. We've got that in the questions. You know, he had that relationship with Bolsonaro in Brazil.
Mhm.
Now seems to have this relationship with Javier Milei, you know, the Argentinian libertarian.
Mhm.
So again, probably some areas where we can't yet be certain, but where there may be some interesting political dynamics playing out.
Absolutely. Milei was at Mar-a-Lago like 2 weeks after the election at a kind of conservative conference and linking arms with Trump and Musk. So there you
And
go.
Musk. Yeah. Okay. Final question. Who will replace Trump in 2028?
It's a good question. I think there's a question of whether or not President Trump will exit stage right or stage left in 2028, or whether or not he'll try to come up with a way to rewrite the rules so that he can run again. That gets to the question about the future of American democracy and kind of constitutional
Indeed.
norms here. I think in terms of who replaces him, the smart operators are going to sit on their hands for the next 2 years at least till we get through the midterms, because nobody wants to be seen as trying to get in front of President Trump or get ahead of him or undermine him in any way. I think in selecting someone like JD Vance, who is, I believe, 42 years old, but exceptionally young to be the vice president,
Mhm.
and I think I said earlier in the conversation, a kind of friend of his son's.
Yeah.
This is perhaps seen as a kind of indication of where he'd like the future of the party to go, or him kind of nodding to a successor. Again, with all of these relationships with President Trump, 4 years is a long time. So that dynamic, I think, will be very interesting to see how it plays out. You
Yeah.
have his children who have perhaps not shied away from suggesting they'd be interested in politics, whether his son, Don Jr., his daughter-in-law, Laura, who's married to his son, Eric. They're really pushing for her to be named as the US Senator in Florida and kind of launch her own political career. So maybe it's someone with the surname Trump.
Mm.
Maybe it's someone else. You know, there are Republicans. We saw in the Republican primaries this year, it was very hard to challenge President Trump. He cleared the field very, very quickly.
Yeah.
But you do have these Republican governors who are trying to thread this needle between kind of embracing his populist message while also not going against the king, as it were.
Yeah.
So I think that tension and those dynamics and whether or not he chooses to anoint some sort of successor is something to really watch for in, I'd say, 2026 and beyond.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll come back to it then. Yeah. A very, very good steer. Okay. Well, yeah. And people in the chat suggesting that this is Elon Musk's long game, is that he wants to be the candidate. But let's see whether he wants to be the world's richest man as well as its most powerful. That may be too much even for Elon Musk. Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed, Lauren, for a wonderful event. Fantastic answers to our questions and to all the issues that are thrown up by this presidency. It's been very, very interesting. So thank you very much for spending your time with us. We really appreciate it. Just to everybody watching, the webinar has been recorded, and as with all of our audio and video, we make it available on our website. So do keep in touch with us. Visit the website, sign up to our newsletter, many more events coming up in the future. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for watching and listening. And again, thank you, Lauren, for your time today. It's been really valuable. Thank you very much indeed.